Hello, I'm Hope Logan. I am an actor on Bold and the Beautiful, and many people really love both me and our Bold and the Beautiful drama. So I've come here to share updates about my beloved Bold and the Beautiful. Everyone, please subscribe and support me. If you do, I will keep coming every day with new updates for you. The drama building inside the halls of Forrester Creations was about to explode in ways no one could fully control, and as the week of May 25th through May 29th unfolded, every relationship seemed to stand on the edge of collapse. Beneath the polished glamour of couture gowns, boardroom authority, and family legacy, tensions were simmering with dangerous intensity, especially for Hope Logan, who could feel the walls closing in around her. For weeks, she had fought desperately to protect her future, her line, and her place inside the company that had become part of her identity, but now the battle was turning uglier and more personal than ever before. At the same time, Liam Spencer was beginning to sense a shift in the chaos, almost as if events were finally moving in a direction he secretly hoped for. Elsewhere, Ridge Forrester found himself exhausted and irritated by pressure from every side, caught between family loyalties, business responsibilities, and the growing emotional fallout caused by Hope's refusal to quietly accept defeat. And looming over everything was the unavoidable reality that another massive confrontation between Hope and Steffy Forrester was about to erupt, threatening to permanently change the future of everyone involved. As the final episode of May Sweeps arrived on Wednesday, May 20th, the atmosphere inside Forrester Creations felt strained beneath the surface, even during moments that appeared calm. RJ Forrester and Zende Forrester tried to reach a fragile understanding, agreeing to work together peacefully for the good of the company, but the tension underneath their truce remained impossible to ignore. Zenda's frustration had been building for far too long, especially as he watched Hope continue pushing against the leadership structure in an effort to protect Hope for the future. He could see how fiercely she resisted stepping aside for Eric Forrester's new couture line, and despite all her efforts to pressure the company, it was becoming painfully clear that she was not going to get the immediate answers she wanted. That reality only deepened Zende's anxiety, because if Hope lost her battle, then his own work and future could disappear with hers. Earlier reassurances from Eric, Ridge, and RJ that hope for the future would eventually return did little to calm him, especially when no one could provide a concrete timeline. Ridge, already irritated by constant demands for answers, admitted that promises had been made to Brooke Logan, but insisted the company first had to repair the damage caused by Katie Logan and Bill Spencer. Yet, beneath Ridge's explanation was an uncomfortable truth he refused to fully confront. Much of this mess existed because of his own decisions, because Eric never would have ended up at Logan if Ridge himself had not created the fracture in the first place. Even as professional tensions escalated, personal emotions quietly twisted themselves into something even more dangerous. Katie found herself questioning her motives regarding Hope potentially joining Logan, and the deeper she examined her feelings, the more complicated everything became. Part of her genuinely believed Hope deserved a better opportunity and a place where her voice would be valued, especially after feeling marginalized at Forrester Creations for so long. But another part of Katie worried that encouraging Hope to leave might unintentionally wound Brooke in ways that could permanently damage their already fragile family dynamics. Katie never wanted to become someone who deliberately hurt her sister, yet she also couldn't ignore the obvious pain Hope had been carrying for months. The emotional conflict inside her became increasingly difficult to separate from the business opportunity standing in front of her. Meanwhile, Hope herself grew more desperate and emotionally raw, especially after placing enormous expectations on Brooke to secure the co-CEO position. To Hope, it felt like her mother had failed her at the exact moment she needed support the most, and although Brooke had been placed in an impossible situation, Hope's disappointment came pouring out with painful force. The hurt between mother and daughter deepened quietly, creating emotional fractures that threatened to become impossible to repair. By Thursday, May 21st, The emotional storm intensified as shocking revelations and growing fears began colliding all at once. Electra Forrester was blindsided by terrifying new developments connected to Remy Price, whose disturbing presence refused to disappear. The unsettling encounter involving Melissa Dillon and Remy inside the design office left lingering fear hanging over everyone connected to the situation, especially because Remy's obsession seemed far from over. He remained fixated on forcing Deacon Sharp back into his life, no matter how much damage he caused in the process. Questions swirled about why Dillon was somehow expected to repair the destruction Remy himself had created, and the emotional burden of that responsibility only made the situation more exhausting. At the same time, there were growing suspicions that Remy's secret connection to Dillon as family would soon explode into the open far faster than anyone expected. Even the strange reappearance of Charlie Weber began to feel ominous, as if his random patrols around the property were quietly building toward a dangerous discovery. The image of Charlie stumbling across Remy lurking in the shadows, hiding behind an almost laughably poor disguise, carried an eerie sense of inevitability. And for Electra, learning that Remy had once again entered her orbit threatened to reopen fears and trauma she desperately wanted to leave behind. At the same time, another emotionally charged scene unfolded at Logan, where Katie and Hope shared a rare, warm moment alongside Liam and Bill. Beneath the comfort of family support was the growing understanding that Hope's future at Forrester Creations was hanging by a thread. Katie empathized deeply with Hope's frustration because she understood how personal the company had become to her, how deeply Hope's identity was tied to the brand she had worked so hard to build. Liam, too, saw the emotional toll everything had taken on her, recognizing that Hope no longer felt respected or valued inside the company she once believed was her home. Yet, despite the warmth of that support system, there was still heartbreak woven through every conversation. Hope's earlier confrontation with Brooke lingered heavily in the air, especially after accusing her mother of failing her. The demand Hope placed on Brooke had been nearly impossible from the start: somehow secure a powerful executive position without actual ownership leverage, but desperation had clouded Hope's ability to see reason. Her fear of losing everything had transformed into anger, and that anger was now pushing her toward decisions that could permanently alter her life. Then came the confrontation everyone feared. Hope returned to Steffy demanding answers one final time, and the tension between them exploded with devastating force. By this point, every leader inside Forrester Creations, Steffy, Ridge, Carter Walton, and even Brooke, understood that Hope for the future simply could not take priority over Eric's couture line at the moment. They weren't necessarily ending the line forever, but they needed patience, something Hope no longer had left to give. Steffy, already exhausted by Hope's relentless pressure, reached her breaking point as Hope continued demanding certainty that nobody could honestly provide. But what truly fueled the confrontation was Steffy's growing realization that Hope had pushed Brooke into attempting to take her position inside the company. Steffy saw through the strategy immediately, and once she understood Hope had been maneuvering behind the scenes, the conflict turned intensely personal. Old resentments, years of rivalry, and buried hostility surged to the surface all at once. The confrontation became less about business and more about power, betrayal, and pride, with neither woman willing to back down as the emotional temperature inside the room spiraled dangerously high. By Friday, May 22nd, emotions across Los Angeles reached a boiling point. Will Spencer prepared to risk his heart by asking Electra to fully choose him over RJ, hoping she would finally commit to a future together instead of remaining emotionally torn between them. But Electra's world had become increasingly complicated, especially with Remy's shadow once again hanging over her life. If she had already learned about Remy's return, then Will's promise to protect her carried even more emotional weight because he had defended her before and stood ready to do it again. Yet RJ was making similar promises, creating an emotional triangle filled with uncertainty, vulnerability, and fear of heartbreak. While romantic tensions escalated, Hope's own future at Forrester Creations moved closer and closer to collapse. Her emotional conversation with Brooke earlier in the week revealed just how much had truly been at stake for her. Hope knew deep down that if Brooke's efforts failed, then she would have no choice but to seriously consider leaving Forrester altogether and joining Logan instead. That realization transformed every interaction with Steffi into something explosive, because Hope was no longer fighting merely for a fashion line, she was fighting for her dignity, identity, and survival. As the week of May 25th through May 29th unfolded, the emotional consequences of every decision began spreading through the lives of everyone connected to the Forrester family empire. RJ and Will both continued fighting for Elektra's heart, while Remy's increasingly dangerous behavior threatened to push the entire situation into chaos. Dylan refused to abandon Remy completely despite everything that had happened, but Remy himself only became more demanding and unstable, creating growing fear about what he might do next. Meanwhile, Hope stood at the center of the storm, emotionally exhausted from constantly feeling powerless under Steffi's authority. Liam, Katie, and Bill saw her pain clearly and became determined to give her an alternative future, offering support, opportunity, and the possibility of launching something entirely new if she chose to leave Forrester Creations behind. Yet Hope's potential departure carried massive consequences for more than just herself. Zende's future was tied closely to hers, and if Hope walked away or was ultimately pushed out after another fiery argument with Steffi, then his own designs might never reach the public at all. The thought of losing everything he had worked for left him devastated, adding another layer of heartbreak to the growing crisis. And perhaps most painful of all was the widening emotional divide between Hope and Brooke. Hope couldn't shake the feeling that her mother had chosen Ridge's approval over her daughter's happiness, and that sense of betrayal continued festering inside her with every passing day. Brooke, meanwhile, found herself trapped between loyalty to Ridge and unconditional love for Hope, unable to satisfy both without hurting someone she cared about deeply. If Hope ultimately walked away from Forrester Creations and joined Logan, Brooke would almost certainly blame Ridge and Steffi for pushing her daughter into a corner where leaving felt like the only remaining option. The tragedy was that every person involved believed they were protecting something important: legacy, family, ambition, loyalty, love, yet their choices were slowly tearing them apart piece by piece. And as emotions intensified across every storyline, one thing became painfully clear: the future of the Forrester Empire and the relationships holding it together would never be the same again. The emotional fallout from Hope's confrontation with Steffi did not fade once the shouting stopped. Instead, it lingered through the halls of Forrester Creations like smoke after a fire, clinging to every conversation, every uneasy glance, and every tense silence shared between employees who could feel the company shifting beneath their feet. Hope walked away from that showdown carrying a storm of anger and heartbreak inside her, but beneath the fury was something even more painful: humiliation. She had fought with everything she had to save Hope for the future, pushed her mother into uncomfortable territory, and demanded answers from leadership over and over again, only to realize that no matter how loudly she fought, the power inside that building still belonged to Steffi and Ridge. That realization cut deeper than she wanted anyone to know. For years, Hope had tried to convince herself that she belonged there because of her talent, her hard work, and her vision, but now she was beginning to wonder if she had only ever been tolerated as long as she stayed quiet and convenient. The more she replayed Steffi's cold responses in her mind, the more she felt like an outsider in a company tied so closely to the Forrester bloodline. And as those emotions built inside her, the possibility of finally walking away no longer felt impossible. It felt inevitable. Meanwhile, Liam Spencer watched Hope carefully, sensing the emotional exhaustion she was trying so hard to hide. Liam understood her in ways many others never fully could, and as he saw her confidence beginning to crack beneath the weight of rejection and betrayal, his protective instincts only grew stronger. There was part of him that hated seeing Hope in pain, but another part quietly believed that leaving Forrester Creations might actually save her from years of emotional damage. He had watched Steffy and Hope battle endlessly for control, respect, and validation, and now it seemed obvious that the toxic cycle would never truly end while they remained trapped inside the same environment. That was why Liam seemed increasingly hopeful as conversations about Logan began becoming more serious. He could envision a future where Hope no longer had to beg for approval or defend her worth inside hostile boardrooms. Around him, Bill Spencer and Katie Logan also rallied behind Hope with growing determination, promising her support if she decided to start over somewhere new. For the first time in a very long while, Hope was beginning to feel something dangerous and intoxicating, the possibility of freedom. But while Hope considered a life beyond Forrester, the consequences of her potential departure began crashing down on everyone else connected to her. Zende Forrester found himself spiraling emotionally as the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. His future as a designer had become deeply tied to hope for the future, and now every heated argument between Hope and Steffy threatened to destroy the opportunity he had worked tirelessly to build. The fear in him was growing sharper each day because he knew that if Hope walked out, then his designs could vanish alongside her line, buried beneath company politics and family power struggles. Although RJ tried to maintain peace and reassure him that things would eventually stabilize, Zende no longer trusted vague promises or delayed timelines. He had already spent too long waiting while leadership shifted priorities again and again, always expecting patience from everyone beneath them. Inside him, resentment toward Ridge was quietly growing, especially because Ridge continued acting as though the situation were entirely out of his control when so much of the damage had started with his own decisions. Zende could feel the company dividing itself emotionally, with loyalties pulling people into separate corners, and he feared that when the dust finally settled, some careers might never recover. At the center of another emotional storm stood Brooke Logan, who found herself suffering from heartbreak on all sides. Hope's accusations continued echoing painfully in her mind, especially the devastating suggestion that Brooke had chosen Ridge over her own daughter. Brooke understood why Hope felt abandoned, but the truth was far more complicated than Hope wanted to admit. Brooke had tried to navigate an impossible situation without detonating the fragile balance inside the company, and despite her efforts, she ended up losing anyway. Ridge had not given her the support she hoped for. Steffy remained firmly in control, and now Hope viewed her as someone who failed when it mattered most. The emotional distance growing between mother and daughter terrified Brooke because she knew how easily wounds like these could harden into permanent resentment. Even worse, Brooke could already feel herself beginning to blame Ridge and Steffy for the emotional corner Hope had been pushed into. Deep down, Brooke feared that if Hope truly left Forrester Creations, it would permanently fracture the fragile peace holding their blended family together. And the tragedy was that no matter which side Brooke tried to support, someone she loved always ended up hurt. Elsewhere, another emotionally tangled story continued building momentum as Electra Forrester struggled to process the terrifying implications of Remy Price's return. The fear she carried was not simple anxiety. It was the kind of lingering dread that settles into a person after trauma refuses to stay buried. Every time she thought she might finally move forward, Remy's shadow somehow crept back into her life, threatening her sense of safety all over again. Will Spencer and RJ Forrester both tried to position themselves as the one she could trust, the one who could protect her, but their competing affection only complicated Electra's emotional state further. She cared about both men in different ways, yet the pressure to choose between them felt overwhelming while fear and uncertainty consumed her thoughts. Meanwhile, Remy himself became increasingly unstable, refusing to let go of his obsession and continuing to pressure Dylan in deeply unsettling ways. The revelation that Remy and Dylan were cousins added another emotional layer to the situation because suddenly family loyalty became entangled with fear, manipulation, and emotional guilt. And somewhere in the background, Charlie's suspicious patrols around the property continued creating a sense that a dangerous discovery was coming closer with every passing day. As all these tensions collided, Steffy Forrester remained outwardly strong, but even she was beginning to feel the emotional strain of the war unfolding around her. She believed firmly that she was protecting the company and honoring Eric's legacy by prioritizing the couture line, yet Hope's relentless accusations had clearly gotten under her skin. The suggestion that Steffy was abusing her authority or deliberately trying to destroy Hope's future infuriated her because, in her mind, she was simply making difficult business decisions that no one else wanted to make. But beneath Steffy's confidence was frustration that had been building for years, rooted in endless cycles of conflict with Hope over power, family influence, and emotional territory. Every confrontation between them reopened old scars neither woman had ever truly healed from. Ridge, too, was feeling crushed beneath mounting pressure as demands came from every direction. Brooke's disappointment, Hope's rebellion, Zende's frustration, Eric's expectations, and Steffy's determination to stay firm. The family empire that once symbolized unity and legacy now felt increasingly fractured by resentment, jealousy, and emotional exhaustion. And as the final days of May approached, it became painfully obvious that the next decision Hope made would send shockwaves through every corner of their lives. By the end of the week, whispers about Hope's future were spreading faster than anyone could control. Employees inside Forrester Creations quietly speculated about whether she was about to resign, whether Steffy would fire her first, or whether Logan was preparing to welcome her with open arms. The uncertainty created a nervous energy throughout the company because everyone understood that Hope's departure would not simply be one employee leaving a fashion house. It would represent the collapse of an entire era. Hope herself stood emotionally at a crossroads, torn between pride, anger, heartbreak, and the desperate need to reclaim control over her own life. She was exhausted from feeling powerless, exhausted from fighting battles she could never fully win, and exhausted from sacrificing pieces of herself just to survive inside an environment that increasingly felt hostile. Yet walking away also meant abandoning part of her history, part of her identity, and part of the dream she once believed she built with love and passion. That emotional conflict weighed heavily on her as she looked toward an uncertain future. And somewhere beneath all the betrayal, heartbreak, rivalry, and ambition, one painful truth remained impossible to escape. No matter what choice Hope made next, nothing inside the world of the Forresters and Logans would ever return to the way it was before.